Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the California Clays podcast. I'm your host, Henning Matthew. And for those of you that have watched the podcast before, you're probably noticing that my little plant over here, Figgy, is not doing so great. Unfortunately, it seems that I'm slowly murdering my plant over here with very little care. And I've been trying to do everything I can to revive her, but right now, this is the current state of Figgy. That's what I've named her. But if you've got any tips or anything for me on how to raise a plant, because I clearly don't know what I'm doing, please feel free to put it in the comments and I'll take your advice. All the Google research I've been doing and the care is probably not working, and we'll see if she makes it through here for the rest of the episodes. But on today's episode, I've got Dominic Grossi. Dominic is a professional sporting clays and FITASC shooter and instructor based out of Houston, Texas. As a member of the U.S. Sporting Clays and FITASC teams for 9 consecutive years, Dominic has won over a dozen medals in international competition, including the men's team gold medal in the 2023 World FITASC Championship in Budapest. In 2025, Dominic has already claimed the U.S. FITASC Grand Prix and the North American FITASC Championship titles to lead the World Cup race going into the World FITASC Championship. Dominic attributes his success to his discipline and technique and strives to implement the same qualities as a coach. So without further ado, let's talk to Dominic Grossi. Dominic Grossi, welcome to the California Clays podcast. Thank you for joining me, man.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I've been following you for some time, and I've always been interested in your kind of shooting career and path. You've been just a really nice person to talk to in the shooting world. And I met you, I think at Nationals one year through Zach and Desi, and you've been, shooting extremely well ever since I've known you. And I really wanted to just kind of get into your head and learn a little bit about your background, your story, and everything that you've been doing in the shooting world to kind of get to where you're at right now. But before we jump into all that, like I just want to catch up with you, man. It's been a little bit. How's everything going? What's going on with you in your world now?
Uh, Everything's great. 2025 has been a pretty crazy year. We've had a lot of blessings. My wife and I found out in January that we're going to be having our first little baby. It's going to be a baby boy.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah, it's exciting. I'm over the moon about it. He's due in September. So trying to shoot and work as much as I can before all of the chaos ensues. But it's been a great year. 2024 was a not so great year for us. We had a lot of just death in the family and things of that nature. So it was nice to kind of return to some level of normalcy and then actually get a couple of just cherries on top in terms of some other things in life going our way. So it's been a great year. I can't complain.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that, man. I've been through that myself too, so I know what that's like and how it can be disruptive
Yeah.
and even just kind of linger, over time with everything that you're doing. So condolences, and hope you and the family are doing well there.
Yeah, it's been a much better year this year. Again, it's kind of been a death and rebirth type of thing. We've had some things end and some things begin, as life tends to do. So all positive things this year, and I couldn't be more grateful for it.
Well, that's awesome, man. So do you know what the baby's gender is yet, or?
Yes, it's gonna be a baby boy. He will be Dominic Carmen Grossi Jr.
Awesome, awesome.
Keeping it very Italian. It's kind of been a naming tradition in the paternal lineage of my family for a long time now, so we just decided to stick with that and just
Okay.
makes it easy on us uncreative people.
So are you guys, so you're Italian,
Yes, very much so.
and what would second, third, fourth generation? Do you know your family background or history, or?
I do. So my great grandfather Dominic immigrated here from the Amalfi Coast region of Italy, like right around the turn of the not this past century, but the one before. And then my family grew up in upstate New York, emigrated through Ellis Island, just as most of those Italian American immigrants do. And then have since kind of dispersed all over the place since then. There's a good handful of my dad's family that still lives up there. And most of my family on both sides is from somewhere in the Northeast. I got a lot of family in New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio. Um, Hence the Eagles helmets over here. I'm a Philly. I was born in Philly, so I'm a Philly fan. Much to the chagrin of all the Dallas people down in Texas where I live. So Yeah, we've since kind of spread out, but very much keep to our Italian roots, at least as far as our anger management and naming abilities go.
What about the cooking ability?
I unfortunately got very little of that. Somewhere along the line, that was lost on my dad's side of the family because he can't cook either. Um, Thankfully, my wife is of Hispanic heritage and can cook very, very well. So that is a plus. I'm trying to get into this whole grilling, smoking thing. Zach Keenbaum is a longtime friend and my coach and everything, and not just shooting, but a lot of different aspects of life. And he's trying to get me invested in that and probably failing to some extent, but trying to learn as much as I can so I can, hopefully take some of the cooking pressure off of my wife in the future.
It's an art. No, Zach's really good at it too. He's kind of like
Yeah.
been focused on it for some time now, and with the different cuts of meat, I always used to joke with him about the picanhas because he loves picanha, and it is
Yep.
a good cut. I just like to give him a hard time about it, but he was really focused on picanhas for a long time.
Well, California, you are tri-tip people too, right?
I know we're tri-tip people, we're fillet people, tenderloin people, so yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But no, that's great. I like to grill. I like to eat more than I like to cook. So, I love Italian food.
Same.
I love food. Who am I kidding? I love every type of food. It was funny. I was on a date last night, and the woman asked me like, "What kind of food do I not like?" And I had to think about it. I don't think there's any food that I don't like. I think I just
Right.
like food. So,
I think I'm
But
right there.
anyways,
I'm not picky. I'll eat
yeah,
just about anything.
right on. Well, hey, so let's talk about your background and your journey into this. What I liked about your story and really why I wanted to interview you here is you kind of have a story that I think a lot of people can relate to, right? You started when you were a junior, you moved up the ranks. You've been competing at an international, not only just national, but international level, which is something that not a lot of people get to do. But, the few folks that do, it's a very interesting world. And I'd say, lesser known world in the shotgunning community, right? Because there's a lot of folks that just stay local. Some people expand regionally. You'll get even more folks going nationally, but going international is like a whole different thing. And since you didn't grow up in the industry or the sport, I really wanted to kind of get your path and how you got into it all. So, would you mind starting us at the beginning and how did you get into shooting?
Yeah, so I think my my origin story is very similar to that of most people. My dad was a trap shooter up in the Midwest. Shot a lot in Ohio, Michigan, all in that area, and that's predominantly what they shoot up there, especially when he was doing it in the 90s. And then we moved as a family down to Texas in 2008, and he was getting back into shooting again a little bit, but there wasn't really a whole lot of trap shooting to be found down here. And as a lot of the people out there know, Houston is very much the sporting clays mecca of the country for a lot of people. It's probably shifted more towards the southeast and the Georgia region here in recent years, but for a long time, Houston was very much the hot spot. So it made sense at that point that we got into sporting clays, and he had a little bit of knowledge and just very naturally gifted in terms of his hand-eye coordination. He was a double A baseball player and a scratch golfer. I mean, he's an annoyingly good athlete, and I didn't get very many of those genes, but I guess I got enough of the hand-eye to be decent with a shotgun. The arms and the legs and all the other athletic ability all went to my brother. So it just made sense at that point that I took this up. It was because I am a competitive person. I just was never super athletically inclined. So we got into that, and that was right about the time I was able to hold a gun. So we started out at Westside Sporting Grounds in Katy, Texas, and that's pretty much where it all began.
And how old were you then?
I started when I was 10, shooting just as much as I was comfortable with at the time. I wasn't a particularly big kid, which probably contributed to the lack of athleticism. But I, as I got stronger, I was able to shoot a little bit more. And really, by the time that I turned 12 or 13 is when I could start really handling a larger volume, and started to, travel a little bit more frequently. By the time that I turned 13, my dad and I got just so into it to the point that I think we shot 15,000, 16,000 registered birds in a year,
Really?
all within Texas.
15,000? You mean combined
Yes.
or just individually?
Each of us shot 16,000.
That's
So,
a
and all
lot.
within Texas. So The neat thing about Houston at that time was there was about 5 or 6 different clubs within about an hour, and in a given month, you could probably shoot 5 different events. Um, probably two on the same weekend a lot of the time. So
Mhm.
I would imagine we probably shot 45 to 50 tournaments that year, all within, 2, 3 hours of Houston.
Wow. What was it like back then? Was it, I mean, it's got to be different than it is now in Houston and the sporting clays and, world, if you will. What was it like? And, how it was just starting to come out into the US, right? It was a relatively new sport. Were there a lot of competitors? Who were the names and the people that you looked up to back then?
So the man to beat at the time and the man that I, kind of grew up seeing at the top of the leaderboard frequently was Bobby Fowler. He was always, he's still to this day probably one of the most accomplished shooters in the US,
Mhm.
uh, the history of US sporting clays. But he was a big force in Houston at the time, especially. There wasn't a big shoot that he was at that he didn't have about a 50% chance of winning. It seemed like it was him versus the rest of the field almost a lot of the time. But then you had a lot of I say younger guys at the time. They were relatively younger, but then you had like the Zachs, the Corey Cruzes, the Anthony Matarices of the world that were starting to make a name for themselves in like the early 2010s. And most of them at that point had accomplished enough to like be household names in the community, but they're obviously much more established now, 15 years later. And they were all just kind of trying to figure it all out. I mean, it was a weird era because, the previous era of like your Bobby Fowlers really kind of just had to figure it out as they went. There wasn't a textbook on how to do this. So for them, it was a lot of trial and error. And I think you could even say the same for Anthony, Corey, Zach, Kevin, all those guys that grew up before there was just this access to coaching that there is now, which I'm grateful in a lot of ways because, I lucked into meeting Zach when I was very young, and got started off on a good path and didn't really give myself to form a lot of bad habits. And so I had almost a blueprint to follow to some extent based on just having a great coach at a young age. Um, but they didn't have that back then. They were just trying to figure out what worked and what didn't, and then they would incorporate certain things into their game. And you can kind of see it in terms of how much the styles like diverged from just the norm. Now there's a bunch of different schools of thought on how shooting should be done. And I think the reason for that is everybody's just found a different way that worked well for them.
Right, right. I always liken shotgunning to kind of martial arts a little bit in the style because there's, your coaches, your mentors, which are like senseis, if you will, in karate. They pass on the lineage of like what they've learned and what they've, trained in for, generations sometimes coming from Japan or China or other places where whatever style of martial art that they're doing. And so like one will be like Miyagi-Do, if you will, and one will be like Cobra Kai. And
Sure.
none of them are right or wrong. They're just different from each other. But you learn the approach and you learn the art of shooting through these different styles. So I found that always interesting that there's these different like established senseis, if you will,
Mhm.
instructors. So when you first got into it, was Zach your coach right from the beginning, or
Yes. Really the only two coaches that I've ever had give me a proper lesson are my dad and then Zach.
okay,
And my dad got me a very long way to his credit, for not having any formal instruction himself.
okay,
Where him and I kind of reached a plateau was my dad was left eye dominant shooting right-handed, which was a great asset in baseball, but not so much for sporting clay. So he was shooting basically with one eye, and the gun was a lot more present in his sight picture than it ever was mine. So
mm,
there started to be some differences in what we were seeing and how we communicated different things. And it was at that point that my dad kind of realized that we needed to go a different direction for my development. So he was, you know, humble enough about it all to be able to take a back seat and say, look, here's this dude, Zach, that is doing all kinds of, really good things in the sport. Obviously he's very talented and knowledgeable. So um, he's local to Houston. It's easy for us to access, go learn everything you can. And he became my coach for about the next really ever since. I mean, if I'm being honest, if I have a problem, I still go call Zach and bother him with, whatever it is that I'm messing up on that given day. But um, I did maybe a dozen, maybe 15 lessons with him before, probably over the course of 6 or 7 years before he wound up moving to Georgia. And then now, I've got enough of his, consciousness ingrained within my own to where if something goes wrong, I can kind of hear his voice in my head telling me one thing or the other. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I mean, it was honestly a blessing at a young age to be able to have access to that. And frankly, the access to coaching everywhere now is so much better than it used to be at that time. The amount of knowledge that's out there is really not secretive at this point. There might have been a point in time where people kind of withheld information because it was a competitive advantage, but everything's publicly available now. Everybody's got, YouTube tutorials and books out, instructional videos. Like there's so many tools to be successful that you could really learn a lot without even having a formal instructor just by hopping on the internet.
Right, right. No, it's a different time and era now, if you will, and I think that's good. I think it's good to get because it gets more people into the sport. It doesn't feel like this, secret world that people can't get access to. It becomes more accessible, which I think the sport really needs to be. Um, I also took lessons with Zach and Desi, and Zach probably was the more influential coach for me. And I think I was telling you this earlier that. He's from California. I'm from California. We speak the same language, if you will. We're about the same age. I think we're pretty close in the same age. I might be a little bit older than him, but I think he's 47 as well.
Mhm.
And so it just felt like I was talking to a friend rather than like this stuffy instructor. Not that any of the other instructors were stuffy, but it didn't feel like a professional relationship. It felt like a buddy talking to me about how to be a better shooter. And
Yeah.
what I didn't realize the first couple of lessons is the depth of knowledge that guy has because he's been thinking about this game for a long time, you know. And some of the stuff that he says at the time I didn't understand. And then there'd be a day where I'm shooting a target, and as I'm shooting the target, I go, "Oh, that's what he was talking about." Did you have those kind of epiphanies as well through your process and in your training with them, or how did your relationship in coach and mentee go?
Yeah, I definitely had a couple of those aha moments. For me, the first one was, my dad shooting with one eye basically taught me to see lead at the end of the barrel, right? It was very much the barrel goes here, the target's here, and, we kind of match the speed as they go across and we give it X amount of lead.
Mhm.
And it was all very calculated at that point. We were taking educated guesses on how much lead stuff took. But we didn't know any other way at the time. So Zach definitely kind of transformed the way I shot and made it a lot more field based and a lot more based around my vision of the target and not a bird barrel relationship. Um,
Wait, not a bird barrel relationship or a bird?
certainly less of one. You know, not 50-50 equal parts, gun and target within your vision at any given point in the shot. Because if I have to think back to it, I imagine that's how I perceived it at that time. Um, but of course, most of us now know that the vast majority of the time we want to be seeing the target far more than we ever do the gun. We need some level of barrel awareness and knowledge of where the gun is at, but we don't necessarily want it to be a focal point within our vision. So that was a change that catapulted my game further a good bit. And the thing that Zach is honestly so good at with a lot of the younger people in the sport is, and something that I try to do within my own coaching but struggle with, is he kind of parcels out information in very digestible bits. And to your point, like he's got this wealth of knowledge, but he doesn't just spring it all onto you at once, which I know as a coach, I kind of have a tendency to do with a lot of people. I kind of just want to, well, this is the tip of the iceberg and the rest of it all in one big thing, right? And, just give them a map for where we're going to go. And Zach's a little bit more trusting of the process, which I think is helpful for especially younger people in the community that can only, digest about one or two concepts at a time.
Right.
So the way that he kind of, you know, uh, designed the curriculum, if you will, for me was very was very linear. It just made a lot of sense in the way that like we continued to build on previous things. And I think that's an aspect of coaching that goes overlooked a lot is just, how you build like a lesson plan out and how you step from one concept to the other without taking a step back to go two steps forward almost.
Hmm.
So Zach excelled at that. And, as a result, I was able to learn a lot and basically shorten my learning curve by, I would say, a good chunk of years.
What were some of the things that you were working on when you first worked with them? Like, what was a technique or a challenge that you had to correct and it took time to fix?
So just the idea that there is more than one way to kill a target. For the longest time, I just assumed the bird was there, my gun was somewhere else, and I pulled the trigger when it felt right. Actually kind of learning the theory behind why matching speed leads to good vision and why, we have all these different techniques in terms of, your pull away, your swing through, your maintain lead, all these different you know, techniques that we use to kill a clay target and why each of them may or may not be useful. I just didn't know what I didn't know at that point. So getting exposure to all of them and learning them kind of from the ground up was a good kind of almost mental reset in a sense. Like we just kind of started from ground zero, and even though I had some ability to hit a clay target in the air, we kind of just learned the curriculum all over again with a little bit of existing knowledge. So um, it was really all of it in a sense. I mean, it was a lot that he taught me in a very short amount of time. I would say that we, at that point in time, definitely probably resorted to pull away more often than not. That was the method that I kind of chose to make my go-to, if you
Blow away.
will. Yes, just because at that point it made the most sense in terms of trying to see the bird very well and matching the speed at the same time, right? It's harder to do that the further away from that focal point of your vision your gun actually gets. So to be 6 or 7 foot out of in front of a target and still be looking at that target was kind of a difficult concept at the
Mhm.
time.
Mhm.
So that evolved into, well, there are targets where we need to start with more than just the front edge and, actually have some lead on there and the gun's going to be over here and your vision's going to be in a totally different place and that's okay. Um, so a lot of different stuff. I mean, we could the short answer to this question would be to go to Zach's instructional website and
Right.
go from the ground up yourself because it's basically a blueprint of how he taught me.
Right.
Um, it, it,
And
it
you helped him create that, right? I think you had helped at least organize some of the information, or hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth, but
I think kind of the guinea pig in his mind. I mean,
yeah.
he obviously had a lot of other students, but he kind of took me from a very base level and brought me to a very competitive level. And uh, I think I was able to help him kind of make chronological sense in terms of the organization of his video. The content is all wholly his own. But just in an organizational sense, I think I was able to kind of help the formatting of that. I just spent a couple nights in Georgia going over the way that he should kind of go about presenting the information and how I remembered it in my mind, because I think he saw me as a good vessel of like his body of work
Right.
to some extent.
No,
So he played a
it's
very
honestly, yeah, and I'm not just saying this because I know him and he was been my coach or anything like that. It's honestly one of the best videos on clay shooting, period, out there right now.
I agree.
His approach, everything that you guys have covered in that, everything he talks about, just how he articulates everything. I think it's probably one of the best videos out there in clay shooting. So if for folks out there that haven't checked it out, highly recommend it. I forget the name of the website, but I'll try to put it in the in the links in the bio. But I think it's claytargetinstruction.com. Does that sound right, Dom? Or
I believe so. Yes.
yeah. No, that's great. So as you're going through and you're starting to learn, were you competing at that time? You were competing because you guys were doing registered targets and everything. And so he was helping you become a better competitor. Um, and you've been competing for a long time now. Like I said, not only just locally, regionally, or nationally, but internationally. What is that like? What does it take to keep that level of consistency when you're starting to go outside of the United States and travel all over and compete everywhere?
It's, it's relying on a lot of the things that you learn and try not to let the fact that it's an international competition, dissuade you from your original plan.
Hmm.
Because it's easy to just kind of psych yourself out. When it comes to just qualifying for the international competition as a junior, for me, competing around the country in as many different venues as possible was beneficial. Just getting used to different target setting styles and backgrounds and venues and what have you. The nature of the travel itself. Um, and then once you do kind of get exposure to most of the places you shoot in the US, shooting internationally doesn't seem like a crazy endeavor at that point. Because if you're from the East Coast and shooting Arizona for the first time, I mean, that's a entirely different world. And then of course, vice versa. I mean, there's so many different climates and, different styles of shooting in the US alone that if you get exposure to a lot of the different regions, you pretty much fill up your library of, exposure with different clubs and presentations and things of that nature. So, um, when you do go overseas at that point, it doesn't seem like that scary of a thing. There's some
There
minor
a
differences.
factor? Is there a factor of like having to adjust to where you're shooting? Not necessarily the climate and things like that, but you're in a new club. You've never been to this club before. You don't know what it's going to be throwing you. So is there an adjustment period for that, or is it next time you go there, you already know what you're up against? Because I remember my first time at nationals, didn't know what to expect, never been there before. And then the second time at nationals, I felt familiar and I felt like I was not at home, but I felt more comfortable there. Do
Yeah,
you experience that as well?
absolutely. I use Arizona as an example pretty frequently because it's so much different from everywhere else in the world. You're shooting with some shrubs and some sand, and then just a massive blue expanse of sky, and it's all black targets, in the sky for the most part. Or
Yeah.
it's just very different. Your depth perception kind of suffers because there's no reference points out there. You can't say, well, oh, that bird crossed that tree at this speed. Like, well, there isn't a tree. The tallest tree is from me to my knee. So, um, I would say it probably took me a good 3 or 4 years of just trial and error to get used to what I was doing out there. All the stuff that I had kind of practiced in terms of like, well, I read speed based on what's happening in the background, and as the bird contours the landscape behind it, I can kind of read the speed. None of that exists. So
Right.
there's definitely some learned skill to shooting in different places, and I don't know that there's like a magic formula to it. I think you just have to do it.
Yeah.
Um, and the target setting tendencies, of course, change a little bit as well. So, Tim Miles in Arizona is going to throw very different targets than Joe Skoll does up in the Northeast. So there's some learning to that as well. And I don't think there's any better way to do it than just going out and getting that exposure, which is something that Zach preached to me at a young age as well. So he had me traveling the tour. I think the first year I did it was in 2014 when I turned 14. Um, and that got me just honestly so much more of an understanding of how many different styles of targets I needed to practice that it kind of like opened my world up in a sense. The world got much bigger at that point.
Right.
Um,
I always
and
feel like when people travel, like when you see local shooters that you've been shooting with for a while and they're doing all right, but as soon as they start traveling and going to different places, their game gets so much better. And it's not even necessarily that they've trained now, it's just they've had that other exposure to where now when they come back home or to their region, I feel like they just perform better because maybe because it's a confidence thing, maybe it's that they've been there, done that, so this isn't as intimidating anymore. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah, there's definitely a level of confidence that you get just going from a regional scale back to local or national or regional or what have you. Because I think everybody kind of views it as a hierarchy to some extent, right? We got international competition at the pinnacle up at the top, and then you go national, regional, local, etc. Um, and the more, exposure you get to those higher level of competitions, you see people, like Anthony Mattery's out there shooting at a pro level. It kind of just opens up the fact that, well, there's all this crazy shooting going on in the world, and my shooting back home doesn't seem that nuts anymore. It seems a lot more digestible.
Yeah.
And I think that just provides people with a lot of confidence. But then the exposure to the targets too. I mean, any experience I think that you get is ultimately going to be helpful. very rarely are you going to go somewhere and come back and get worse. It hasn't ever happened in my experience or with any of the students I've ever had. So, you know, if you're going in with a relatively objective perspective and just try to learn something everywhere you go, you're just going to continue to get better.
When you look back at your earliest competitions, international, national, what were some of the biggest lessons you brought home that changed how you prepared?
Um, I would say that I really started to understand that the higher up that hierarchy that you get, the more emphasis you needed to pay to your mental game and visual game.
Mm.
Um, for a lot of that time, just going through the motions of shooting different places, you're kind of just trying to figure out how to hit birds. But once you get to a level of understanding and you're shooting in the, let's say, mid 80s, then every bird after that just becomes a lot harder to add to your scorecard. So for me, it was a lot more eye-opening in terms of the way that I needed to practice. It was, I probably spent 5 years just getting exposure to every different type of target out there. And then it was a matter of, okay, how do I turn, sevens out of eights into eights out of eights? Because, there wasn't a bird out there I couldn't hit. I just didn't know how to do it 4 times in a row.
Right, right. It's like the
So
biggest
it just
challenge
shifted
in
my
plays, I feel
lens.
like it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
what was
just
that? What was that
eye-opening.
journey for you then? How did you get that, you know, go from 7 to 8 to 8 to 8?
I'm still trying to figure it out. That's been the last 10 years of my, shooting journey is trying to do that consistently until ideally we don't ever miss again, as foolish as that sounds. But
Yeah.
it's coming up with first and foremost the right methodology that lends itself to the most consistency. I mean, certain target presentations kind of favor better moves, in my opinion. A quartering bird might be better suited to, a slower gun movement type of shot just because of the fact that the lead is constantly decreasing, right? So a crossing shot, we've got a lot more leeway to do really whatever we want with it because we typically have a lot of time. But all the angles that play definitely kind of cater to different styles of shooting. So you'll see, I mean, pretty commonly that if a course favors a given set of targets, you might see somebody from shooting school of thought A shoot well, and then the next tournament it's a very different set of targets, and the whole podium is filled with shooting school B.
Hmm.
Um, the different schools of thoughts kind of prevail based on the trend of the target, if you will. So it also just kind of opens up your eyes to the fact that you really need to learn it all. And the more that you can kind of incorporate into your game and learn from different people, I think the better equipped you are to run more eights than sevens, because I don't think there's any one magic tool that just, gets you over the hump there. It's trying to find what works on every different presentation for that, and it's not a cookie cutter answer.
So does it become a thing I mean, consistency obviously is key, right? In mechanics and what you're doing and how you're doing it. But there's variables at play because we're shooting sporting clays where the wind can affect the trajectory of a target that you've been shooting consistently. Now it goes up a little bit or dips down a little bit. So does it also just become your connection with that target, and that's why Zach and a lot of coaches talk about syncing up with the target. And even though you may think that your break point is this little section of the sky that you or area that you're going to hit it, you still need to be able to adapt if in case something changes. So it's not only just a consistency thing, but it's a I mean, help me fill in the blank of what I'm trying to say, but it becomes more of like a just stay connected and feel it rather than just think you're going to break it in this one thing and make one move. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Absolutely. So, I've heard in some of your previous podcasts, Anthony started to talk about the emphasis on the vision of the target. And really the thought process behind that is in order to be ultimately successful in this game, we need the most recent information on the target the moment that we go to shoot it. So naturally at that point, we want our best vision of the target at the break point. Um, and learning how to set yourself up for that is not a small endeavor because every target, of course, has a different amount of time that elapses from point A to point B, different angles at play. So learning how to use your eyes, not only just to see a target well at the break point, but how to position them in such a place that will get you there in the appropriate amount of time becomes very important as well.
Mhm.
So there's a big part of this underlying concept that Zach calls visual discipline, that I basically refer to as intensity plus timing. And from a young age, I think intensity is instilled in most of us. We kind of understand, well, we're supposed to see some clarity on this bird. We can see the ring sometimes when the bird's particularly close. We can get really detailed on what part of the bird we're looking at. And that intensity part's not really that difficult to understand or even execute, but doing it with the correct timing over and over and over again is what most people are lacking in the consistency department.
No, that's interesting because I feel like as you get I think once you reach master class, right? That's really the beginning, I think, of your training because to your point earlier about your turning your 80s and your 7 and 8s at to 8 and 8s, it's really about fine tuning every little aspect of what you're doing and preparing yourself for that break. And you have to be able to adapt according to what's happening to the target. So syncing up and vision sync is important. But I think that's the hardest part of the game, is it not? I mean, just what planning is one thing. Over time and experience, you develop a way to plan and figure out what's the best plan for you. But I'll give you just a stupid anecdotal situation. So I like to tell myself that I'm not good at far slow targets, but then I go shoot a tournament where someone was videotaping or videoing me, and I'm shooting slow and far targets. And what I'm doing differently from what I did in a tournament was, instead of being gun up and I'm watching, when I was shooting the other tournament where I was consistent in shooting it well, I was out of pocket. I was watching the bird and then slowly bringing the gun up. So my gun speed is a lot slower shooting a far and slow target, where before I'm making moves that are fast and quick that don't work as well with slow and further targets. So I guess my point is like it's a constant exercise and trying to figure out what works for you, how to be consistent about it. Do you find that it's over time you just get better and better and better at it, or where do you find that you get it and then you lose it sometimes? I guess what I'm trying to say.
This is probably one of the few things that I would say is very hard to figure out on your own, and very few people did until this information became more readily available. But really understanding the dynamics between how to soft focus the target, where to set your eyes. We kind of use those two terms, alongside each other, um, in order to achieve the best vision at the right time in the shot, right? So you mentioned shooting like a long developing bird with the gun out of your shoulder. It's kind of a band-aid way of going about that in a sense,
Right.
because what you're essentially doing is programming your brain to say, well, I know that I'm not really looking down the gun at this point, so I probably shouldn't be focusing hard on that bird yet. And in doing so, you achieve this correct timing, but in reality, you could also do that with the gun up if your soft focus was, you know, placed and timed correctly.
Right, right.
So,
That's a good point. And I appreciate you understanding what I'm saying, because when I asked the question, I was like, I don't think I'm making sense here, but you picked up on it
oh
exactly.
yeah, no, and you described it well. I mean, it's a hard thing to put into words because I mean, you're describing a visual, and we have all these words that in essence just mean see the bird well at the right time. We
Right.
use this phrase so often as community that like it's lost all meaning. Like, well, look at the bird. Well, I'm not looking at the tree. Like, of course I'm looking at the bird. Um, so that phrase has become so watered down, and I think people are kind of even tired of hearing about vision as a concept to some extent because of how often it gets brought up. But it's it's very hard to explain, and it can be very misunderstood as well. So I think it is important that we are having these conversations about it.
Well, this is, I think, what Zach references when he says "see it late, see it break," and when you pick up the target in its trajectory. Are you seeing it early? Are you seeing it later in the trajectory? How much are you ramping up your focus, and when are you looking at it? And so, are you thinking about that for each presentation? Like, does that go into your planning process? Like, okay, look, it's arcing across the sky here. I'm obviously not going to shoot it here because I don't see it as well here. I'm going to pick it up here. I'm going to move the gun into the target, really ramp up my focus in this area. Is that like how you talk to yourself, or is it
Absolutely.
okay?
As a matter of fact, like that to me is my mental routine for a competition in a nutshell, is just touching on the visual aspects of the shot that I need to achieve good discipline on in order to be successful. Because at the end of the day, I kind of choose to view it like this. So we have this library of different shots kind of in our brain. So your brain is the computer in this equation. But the one thing that we need to try to leave as unadulterated as possible is the input that you receive, right? Which is, of course, what you are seeing in that given point. Um, the rest of the math kind of does its own thing and behaves the way that it should, so long as you don't get too much in your own head. So as long as we don't kind of screw up the input, the output becomes pure as well. So if we
Right.
purify the input, we purify the output, and that process, in my opinion, is what allows us to execute at the highest level when we're not thinking about the mechanics of what we're doing. Because frankly, if you're concerning yourself with that while you're actually trying to break a clay target, you're probably doing too much mental math.
Right, right. That's where the trust comes in, right? Is that hand-eye coordination calculation that you're talking about that gets automatically done for you as long as the
Yeah.
input's going in well? That's the trust component, is it not?
Yeah, and frankly, it's muscle memory from stuff that you've practiced previously as well. So, um, when we look at practice, right? I mean, I choose to view it in two different, very separate entities. There's a very mechanical sense of practicing where you're just working on a particular move. We're very conscious of what's happening with the gun. You're learning hold points, break points, where to insert, all these different things that physically relate to the gun itself. And then you have the visual aspect of it, which is, okay, I've learned all these different concepts. I've built them into my computer. Now I just want to have them run through my computer without interrupting it.
Hmm.
And those two things can get really convoluted because the moment that you kind of mix them up is when your computer gets all confused and starts flashing the blue window of death or whatever we used to call it in the tech industry. But
I think
um,
my computer needs a couple software updates, to be honest, but
right, yeah,
I'm
it's
still running Windows 5 over here, so
right. It's a hard thing to keep virus free in that same analogy. I mean,
that's
it's a hard thing to, keep all those other thoughts out. And so that's why this whole concept of mental game exists, because basically the whole premise is we're just trying to do something that keeps that process as natural as possible.
yeah,
The moment that, the phrase, the kind of way that I always explain this to people is think about all the times that somebody's like thrown you the wrong bird or there was a no bird on a station and your eyes just went to it and killed it, right? You had no time to throw anything else at your computer. You just saw the input and the output spat itself out, and normally we break that bird somehow
right,
without an understanding of how. We're
yeah,
kind of trying to do that every shot we take within a controlled and more planned environment.
right, right.
So the mental game really does boil itself down to how do we reduce all the feedback and, static that takes place in your computer processing system and just achieve a pure output that's solely based on what you are seeing.
So I was talking to someone about this yesterday, who's a relatively newer shooter, and I was telling them that you almost kind of need to go through that overthinking phase a little bit so that it
Hmm.
becomes the foundation of your software, if you will. It's just continuing the analogy.
Sure.
But after that, then, through repetition, through muscle memory, through experience, it then becomes that, fluid kind of flow motion state that you get into. Would you agree with that, or am I talking out of my, what?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think there's in the grand scheme of your learning curve, you have to learn what Anthony would call the science behind it first before you can achieve the feel.
Right,
So, I talk a lot to students of mine. They're like, well, I'm a very analytical person. Like, I'm very much, doing math in my head as I'm shooting these shots. Like I'm paying attention to the angle and the geometry of the whole thing. And, I just have 100 different thoughts going through my head about what's happening with my gun and my eyes. And I'm trying to make it all make sense. And it's important to have an understanding of all those concepts because without that, we can't really achieve the feel that results as, all that muscle memory does manifest itself in a natural feeling move. So even though you do go through that phase, we also then work away from it at some point too. Like it's important to kind of build that understanding, have it become part of like your subconscious, and then when you are shooting, we kind of just use that as it's kind of just kind of operating on a loop in the back of your mind without really having to consciously think about that.
yeah. I know you're no longer a junior shooter. You're in your mid 20s, and but you started off as a junior shooter, and I think a lot of people can kind of relate with your story because of that, right? You kind of came up the ranks, and now you're in the open category. Obviously, you're leading the World FITASC rankings, by the way. Which congratulations! I know you just won and I'm going to butcher the name of this. It was the North American FITASC.
Mhm.
What else is it called? It's like a long-winded name, but.
So there's a couple of World Cup events. The North American FITASC was up at M&M, and then the US FITASC Grand Prix
Grand
was
Prix.
over at Eagles Nest in Ohio.
Okay. And
And
so
yeah, was fortunate enough to win both of those and start the year off strong in FITASC.
that's awesome, man. And I love feet tats, but I feel like it's this, esoteric, like unknown world that even shotgunners don't know too much about. Can you maybe shed some light a little bit about what the cups are? A little bit about not what World Feet Task is, because I think most people watching this know what it is. But how did you decide that to be your sport?
So I spent a good chunk of years shooting on the US Sporting Clays team, and the way that you qualify for that is by basically competing in the championship tour. And there was a point in time where the World Cup events and the championship tour were all held in conjunction with each other. So we could get to all these really cool 200 bird feet task events and shoot 200 sporting clays in the same weekend and have it be like a kind of this mega event. And there was kind of a schism between FITASC and the NSCA about 6 years ago now. I think it was 2019. Don't quote me on that, but where they separated them out and FITASC World Cup events became their own thing and the Championship Tour event became its own thing. And because you still qualified for Team USA by shooting the Championship Tour, I kind of catered my shooting to that for a long time, even though my ultimate goal was to make the FITASC team to compete at the World FITASC. I was missing all these other World Cup events to do that just because I only had, so many opportunities to travel at that point. Adding three more events to the schedule just didn't make sense. So, um, the World Cup shoots as they exist now basically consist of every country has its own Grand Prix. Every continent has its own continental championship. And then there's the World FITASC, which is kind of the culmination of all of that. And so the World Cup race is basically your best Grand Prix, your own continental championship score, and your World FITASC score.
Got it. Okay.
So you can basically combine those three for a total of, it works in percentages, so 300%. If you're the high at the event, you make it 100%. Everybody else is, whatever their score was as a percentage of yours. So um, it's basically a culmination. It's kind of like a tour in a sense. And the World FITASC itself is, I would say the holy grail in terms of sporting clays based accolades. But the World Cup is definitely something that international shooters especially value pretty highly because it does represent consistency in the sport of FITASC. Um, for
And
all
it's
the
a
other
World
countries
Cup,
that
even
shoot.
though it's within this country, it's a World Cup because it's a field of international competitors, right?
Yes, and to be fair, like so, because we have our own tour here of sporting clays, keep in mind that most of these other international countries only shoot feet tests. They don't have English sporting clays the way that the US and England do. So for them to shoot 12 or 14 events in a year, they'll just go to other countries' Grand Prix.
Got it.
So, a shooter from France, for example, might shoot the British Grand Prix, the Hungarian Grand Prix, and that's all easy for them to get to, just as, you and I would travel to a different state within the US. So they get a lot of international competition, even on their national Grand Prix level. And then the European FITASC Championship, which is their continental championship, is basically as hard to win as the World Championship, minus the Americans being there. Just because that's the bulk of where all of the good European shooters are, and they're all attending that event. So as proud as I am to have won North America this year, I mean, I'm really beating one country. The Europeans have to beat seven or eight other ones that are super, super talented fields within themselves. So, um, the US is kind of standalone in a sense. Like all of our World Cup events do feel a little bit nationalized just because of how, far removed we are from the rest of Europe. But everybody else tends to kind of intermingle at each other's World Cup events.
Interesting. Okay. How is that? community different than the sporting clays community, would you say, or is it?
Um, I would say it's fairly similar. I mean, other than of course the natural language barriers and whatnot. But the thing that I do enjoy about FITASC is the fact that it's a little bit more globalized. I mean, if you go to the World Sporting Clays Championships, there's really only two countries that make an appearance. There's about 40 countries that show up to the World FITASC.
Mhm.
And I think it's cool to see all the different cultures kind of combine and form this collective because it's a bunch of people from different walks of life and different areas throughout the world and all trying to accomplish the same goal, which is break a clay target. And the ways that we take to get there are honestly pretty appallingly different sometimes.
Really?
Um, yeah, so
In what sense? Like, oh, you're not talking
I'll,
about
I'll give
technique.
you a quick anecdote. I shot with a guy from Thailand a handful of years ago, and he just had never shot on an international level. And they are very much where like the United States was 20 years ago at this point. Where they're just trying to figure it out. They don't have like this, you know, kind of set of curriculums that they can follow in order to like progress as a shooting community. They're very much just, trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. It's almost as if they're 20 years behind in their knowledge as a community. Um, and frankly, I don't think they've been shooting it that long, so that's through no fault of their own. But it's cool to see them go through that process and try to figure it out. And then, every once in a while they get exposure to something at an international level and take that home with them, and then the whole community kind of learns from that. Um, it's very odd. So like you'll see them doing just some stuff that like I would never see here. Like I watched him, basically uh take this one shot. I remember it really clearly, but it was a true pair, and he killed the first bird that was moving left to right, and the other one was going in the opposite direction. And he just basically stayed in a straight line and shot them both in a straight line and didn't even like kind of course correct for the second bird. He just made one decision on where he wanted to move his gun for both shots and shot them both on that line.
Interesting.
And I don't know that that's it did in that particular circumstance, yes, because I remember turning around to the one other English speaking person on our squad and I was like, I don't know what just happened, but it worked. So, yeah, there's just some weird schools of thought out there. I mean, some people are very much, trying to figure out, well, maybe if I just make one move, there's less margin for error. I mean, it's a logical train of thought. I think we've, as a community, learned that that's probably not the best practice most of the time. But, I'm sure 30 years ago, Americans were very much in that same place.
Hmm. No, that's interesting. And what I'm happy to hear though is that there's more countries getting involved in this. Do you know how many countries there are that compete in World FITASC?
Anywhere between 40 and 50 typically make an appearance when it's in Europe. We get a few less when we host it over here just because I think the accessibility is a little bit smaller, being that it's so much farther away from like the Far East and Australia, things like that. Um, so Europe is very central, and so like this year at the World FITASC, I wouldn't be surprised to see 45, 50 countries represented.
Is it easy for folks outside of the country to come into the US with their guns versus, you going into another country? Like, just for example, I'm going to England next year and I was looking into what it takes for me to just bring my gun and I have to get vouched for and I have to fill out this application. Do you know if it's relatively easy for folks to come in this way or is it?
I can't really speak to that just because I've never been through the process myself.
Yeah.
Going abroad for me has always been relatively easy. You typically have one or two forms that every individual country requires, whether that's like a police department that's local to where you're competing, and like I'm sure that's probably what you're dealing with for England right now. Like to go to the World English this year, you basically need a permit from the Surrey Police Department.
Mhm.
But that's really all you need. You send off for that form, you get it back in, a handful of weeks, and then that you bring that with you, and that's it. There's some countries where it is, I would say, pretty easy. Now I'm also sure that there's a lot of countries where it's not that easy. I mean, the moment that you probably deviated away from Europe and the UN and all that kind of stuff, you would or sorry, not the UN, but the EU, you'd probably run into some more things that you would have to, more hoops that you would jump through for that. But my experience traveling internationally has been pretty straightforward and pretty easy.
So what countries, if you can recall, have you been to so far for shooting?
So I've had the chance to shoot in the UAE as recently as this year. I've shot in England, Italy, shot in Hungary a handful of times. Shot in France. Sure, I'm missing a couple. Um, going to going to Cyprus this year for the World FITASC in a couple weeks. And then
Nice.
the next two World FITASC are being held in Portugal and Spain in 2026 and 2027. Plan on making those as well. So um, by this time, 2 years from now, it'll probably be about a dozen different countries.
Which venue or country left the strongest impression on you?
Just in a very personal sense, Italy, just because of the heritage I have there. And it's beautiful too. You know, we've shot two World FITASC in Italy that I've been a part of now, and both of them were just the venues were incredible, the food's obviously incredible. Um, they get really, really gorgeous terrain over there. I would say that one was the most memorable for me for more of the personal reasons than anything else, but for I would say the average person that doesn't have ties to their direct heritage at that particular country, I would say England is one that's a pretty transformative experience too, just because you get so much of like this like old school gentlemanly culture. You know, you got like there's rules that you can't even, you're not even supposed to wear camo over there while you're shooting. Like there's just a much different dress code and formality about it that's different than what we have here. It's a lot more sophisticated in a sense, and that definitely makes a lasting impression on most people.
No, I love that. I can't wait till I go to England and get to shoot and tour around to different clubs. So it's a bucket list thing for me to do, and I'm looking forward to that. You've competed in all the countries that you've talked about. How do you adapt to traveling across the time zones and the climates and everything? I mean, you talked a little bit about when we were talking about the different regions and stuff here in the US, kind of help prepare you for that. Is that kind of the same when you're going international? Like you feel relatively prepared? Are you going early? What's your um, tips for handling all that?
So I would say that it's definitely different going across several time zones than just going East Coast to West Coast like we do here domestically. For me, as long as I keep to a relatively rigid itinerary of this is when I'm going to sleep and this is when I'm going to make sure that I stay awake, I've always been able to avoid the jet lag.
Okay.
So generally flying, east to go overseas into Europe, I try to sleep as much as I can on the plane, which I know a lot of people struggle with that, but for me, I've never really had a problem sleeping on planes. So I try to get as much sleep as I can. And then the biggest goal is the day you arrive, you always have this temptation to fall asleep at about 3 or 4 o'clock. And you have to fight that as hard as you can and try to make it through to a reasonable bedtime. That way, when you wake up the next morning, you're basically back to normal again.
Yeah.
The moment that you kind of succumb to that, tiredness and say, well, man, I just want to take a nap for an hour. And I've done it before, and you fall asleep for 6, 7 hours, get a good night's sleep, and then you're up at 4 in the morning. And it's like, well, now what? So I think as long as you plan it relatively well and kind of just are conscious of your own needs as far as your sleep goes and everything, you can avoid a lot of the jet lag that gets involved because that's about the only thing that you really have to adapt to
Mhm.
in terms of like the just the feeling of being over there, so to speak.
What about like logistics and target setting and like the culture of different countries? Like, what do you think more American shooters should prepare for if they're traveling internationally?
So on average, I mean, everything over there is a little straighter and faster in terms of target setting. And really the reasoning behind that is just the equipment. So first and foremost, you're shooting an actual international target, which for those of the people out there that don't know, we shoot 108 millimeter targets here in the US. The 110s that they shoot overseas are not only just a little bit bigger, but they're thinner and denser. So they don't have these targets that kind of sit and stall and get this kind of knuckleball effect that we have here. Everything pretty much holds a straight line more so over there than it does here. Um, so as much as you can practice, trying to take targets in what we would call like under power, basically meaning that they're still, they haven't like started to descend. They're still like holding their initial velocity on the way up. I would say that's really good practice for overseas because those targets really just don't slow down the way that they do here. So, if we were to take a target here that was just showing us some belly at 30 yards crossing at a medium speed, we'd probably take it just after the apex when it was at its slowest. That point over there is probably 40 yards further away than it would be here. So, getting comfortable just basically not waiting for that bird to stall out and shooting it while it has some pace to it is probably the biggest difference.
Interesting. So what did you do to adjust while you're training in the US with 108s to be able to shoot, 110s?
Um, I would say that there's not really I mean, other than just trying to seek out birds that have relatively straight lines, there's not a whole lot that you can do to really get yourself adjusted other than just when you get over there practicing a little bit. I would say that it probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just go really, really crazy with your practice here prior to one of those events because you're going to basically memorize a lot of lead pictures that frankly aren't going to be entirely correct over there. It's going to feel like they're all about 10 or 20% short. Um, but at the end of the day, a target is still a target. If you can read it correctly and just make sure that your vision of the bird is at its best when you're planning to shoot it, then all the same rules still apply as they do here. So even though there's some different target setting tendencies, as long as your reading ability is relatively seasoned, it does pretty much translate.
You've got multiple medals both in World Sporting and World FITASC, which is, incredible, by the way. Which of those performances are you personally most proud of?
Good question. So I would say that the one that stands out the most in my memory is the team gold medal at the 2023 World FITASC in Hungary.
Mm.
And the reason behind that is I get emotional about the team events sometimes just because it's the one time a year that we do get to compete like as a team. I mean, it's a very individual sport other than that. Um, so I really
Representing
enjoy
the
that
U.S.
dynamic.
You're representing the U.S. at the international stage, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's an immense sense of pride that I get from that. There's also a lot of nerves that come with it too, because your biggest fear is to be the low man on the foursome, right? You don't want to be the guy that's the anchor, so to speak. But that particular year was a special one for me. I had made the men's team the 2 years prior as the alternate, which comes with significantly less stress just because your score doesn't immediately count for the team. But this particular year that I'm talking about, the team was my coach and longtime friend Zach Keenbaum, Anthony Matarese, and Gavin Miles, who, in addition to all being World FITASC champions themselves, are probably the three individuals that influenced my life and shooting the most. Um, so for me to be a member of that foursome with those three people, that was like my dream team. If you would have asked a 12-year-old Dominic Grossi who he wanted to be on a Team USA with when he got older, that was it. And to be able to win that gold medal there, the kind of unique personal triumph story that I have is I wasn't really shooting well that week, but the last day we were probably 6 or 7 targets behind the French team. And we all knew that we needed a good score to have a chance. And I managed to pull out a 25 on my last parkour that literally put us at exactly the total we needed to win.
That's awesome.
So that was a nice personal anecdote because otherwise that week was not very was not very successful for me on a personal basis. But being up there and hearing our national anthem on the top of the podium with those three guys was super special.
So speaking of Team USA, I'm sure with traveling and going around with the team, it's been fun. But what's your favorite travel memory that has nothing to do with shooting with Team USA?
Um, so I don't recall what year it was, but I remember very distinctly that when we were in France one time, we had a hard time finding good food, and I hear a lot of conflicting information about oh, France has great food, France has terrible food. I'm not going to judge because I haven't, my sample size is so incredibly small that I don't feel entitled to make that kind of opinion. But uh, there was a van of us that after a day of shooting, we're trying to find a place to eat and could not for the life of us find anything that looked good. And like beckoning across the way, we saw the neon light of a KFC. And so there was a van of about seven of us, and we were all just kind of like packed into this little tiny minivan. And this poor French lady was trying to listen to us order drumsticks and, using all the American terminology for how we describe chicken. And I don't think she had a clue. So finally, I think Bill McGuire was in the middle of the van and he just kind of looked out the window and said, "Sweetheart, just give us a lot of chicken." So we just got a bunch of buckets of chicken and parked and ate it basically outside of the van like a bunch of homeless people. But it was an incredible experience. It's one that sticks out of my memory just because it seems so out of place to be at a KFC in a foreign country.
No, that's awesome. I think that's hilarious too. I don't know Bill, but that just sounds like a Bill comment, you know?
Yeah, he's kind of just got that southern sweetheart,
Yeah.
that big drawl, and that poor lady probably just doesn't have a clue what to think of us. So
What do they call like drumsticks something different in France or
well, we didn't know. I mean, I'm sure there's a French word for it that we were just completely missing, right? So we're trying to I'm sure she knows chicken in English, but to try to describe like the part of the chicken that you're trying to order was the barrier there. So, we were trying to describe as best we could, like we want a leg, we want a thigh, we want to, whatever, and it was just getting completely lost in translation.
that's hilarious. That's too funny. Do you find when you're traveling internationally that you have any like competitors that obviously I'm sure you've developed friendships with, but any competitors that you've developed rivalries with also?
Um, as a junior, I definitely kind of had a little bit of a personal rivalry with this other British junior, and we were friends as well, but we definitely were trying to beat each other as often as we could. Uh, and it culminated in the 2017 World FITASC. We shot off for the junior title, and he got the best of me there.
Can
That
I
was
ask
about
who it is or
yeah, his name is Josh Bridges. He's not, I don't know that he shoots a whole lot anymore. I think he's gone on and started to do other things with his life, but he was very much the guy I was trying to beat internationally. And, losing to one of your fellow Americans on the team doesn't feel all that bad. At least you're, kind of keeping it in the family, but losing one of those titles to a foreign competitor and somebody that you consider a rival hurts a little bit more.
yeah. Hey, is there anyone else? Like who else have you befriended through international travel and competition?
So one of my really good friends that I met at the first World FITASC I ever shot is a young man my age named Tristan Stubbs. He's from South Africa, and he actually wound up moving to the U.S. to attend college at Lindenwood. Shot in the U.S. for 4 or 5 years and is now working up in Northbrook.
Yeah.
So
I know Tristan. I met him when I went to the Winter Spectacular at Gary's place. Super
yeah,
good dude, and a really good shot. In fact, I
yes,
think he won the internet. I think he won nationals as the international competitor
I think
this
you're
last
correct.
year.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, he's a really good shot. Super good dude. I like Tristan a lot.
Oh yeah. Him and I go back about 10 years now and again like the cultural shock was hilarious because the first year he was here we'd go out to eat somewhere and he'd be like, "What the heck is this on the menu?" Like there was a lot of things he just hadn't had exposure to that made it just fun and frankly just had a lot of good memories doing that kind of stuff.
That's too funny. Let's change focus a little bit from international to like your training and like your technique and kind of how you do things. Like I said, you've kind of you come up the ranks. You're shooting on an international stage. You've won world medals. What does like a focused training block look like for you? Like, are you handling specific drills or is it mental rehearsal? Do you do physical conditioning? Do you work out? Like, what's your thing?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, what I'm doing right now is probably a good glimpse into it just because the World Feed Task is 2 weeks away and that's what I'm gearing up to shoot. Um, I divide my practices into two very specific types. There's a lot of times where I just want to go out and work on a particular technique or a facet of a move that I need to, kind of sharpen up. Um, so again, that's that very mechanical practice
Hmm.
where
Are you
I'm
talking about
very
mounting mostly, or is it like how you move the gun and control it?
so for me, it's had a lot to do with like my mount speed and tempo for feet task, but that practice could be even in sporting clays, it could be just about anything. It could be just making sure that I have the correct hold point, that I'm, making a move that is representative of the target I'm trying to shoot. Maybe I'm trying to insert just a little bit of gap in front of the bird and stretch away a little bit extra, but instead I'm, just having this tendency to only go to the front edge every time at the beginning of that shot. So stuff that I'm very aware of, just trying to sharpen up with my where my gun is physically pointed, is the first type of practice. And then the second type is much more of like a competition emulation where I'm solely focused on going through my mental routine and getting my vision as well equipped for success as I can make it. Being very disciplined with where I'm setting my eyes, the size and placement of where I have them started at every shot, and then how I get to my hard focus by the end of that shot and what that timing feels like. So that's the one that I am practicing the most right now, being that that is what I'm going to be trying to do when I actually do compete when I go overseas and for any other competition for that matter.
What do you mean about size? Is it kind of like how much of the area that you're looking at and how you narrow down, or what do you mean by that?
Yeah, exactly that. So when I describe soft focus to people, I basically describe it as, whether you want to call it a circle, or I think like Desi, for example, refers to it as like a bubble, but whatever shape you have, you basically have your eyes placed in an area, right? And that area we want to be basically big enough to be able to acquire the bird as it emerges from either the trap or the woods or wherever it is that it's coming from. Um, and large enough to where, it encapsulates a little bit of variance in the target. If the target takes 2 to 3 seconds to come out of the woods, then maybe my circle's a little bit larger. If I can see the machine the whole way, then it's probably going to get a little smaller at that point. I can be a little bit more specific with my soft focus there. And then basically what happens after that is that circle kind of forms a cone into your hard focus where you're at this very pinpoint level of detail oriented hard focus at the end of the shot. So kind of controlling how lengthy you want to make that cone in a sense
Hmm.
to get from this area of soft focus to suck it into some like really detail oriented hard focus in whatever time interval you are needing to do that.
Do you do any kind of eye training outside of shooting and looking at targets? Is there anything specific that you do to, you know, work out your eye muscles, for example, or anything like that?
No, not really. And I've always been blessed with good vision. I haven't, I've never needed any kind of correction or anything like that. But
You're still
yeah,
young, my friend. You're still young. That's
I
why.
am. And to your point, I'm just a little bit scared of the next couple of years because my dad has told me that all the men in our family tend to have their vision decline around the age of 30. And I'm like, well, I'm gonna try to hold that off for as long as I can. But other than, just, obviously staying well hydrated and eating your fair share of blueberries to keep your eyes as acute as possible. No, nothing really off the field. Just trying to be as disciplined with my eyes as often as I can when I'm actually shooting.
Yeah. When I was talking to Anthony also, I was asking him about like, does it help when you're coaching too? You don't necessarily need to shoot to benefit from eye training or seeing targets and, making plans, et cetera. Do you think that's extremely helpful looking at a lot of targets and being able to kind of see different presentations, et cetera? Does that help you?
Yes and no, and honestly, probably more no. Um, it's beneficial in the sense that you are thinking about where the correct place is a lot of the time, but where it can be a detriment is when I'm, coaching somebody, I'm really not focused on seeing the bird the way I would as if I were shooting it myself because I'm trying to pay attention to what the shooter is doing. So
Hmm.
I'm a lot more aware of what's happening with their gun. Frankly, for the first 50% of the shot, a lot of the time, I might not even be looking at the bird because I'm trying to pay attention to what the beginning of their move looks like. Um, so in a sense, it's almost reinforcing behavior that I would say is contradictory to what I'm trying to achieve because I'm much more aware of what's happening with their gun throughout that process.
Interesting.
Um, so not always as cut and dry, like, oh, you're seeing all these targets at the time, all the time. It's really not quite that simple. Even though I do see a lot of birds fly through the air, I don't look at them the way that I should. Honestly, probably the majority of the time that I'm out there at the gun club because I'm coaching more often than I am practicing at this point. So getting myself back to the level of visual discipline that I need to have is what I'm currently working on in order to, try to compete at my best.
So that's what you would say you're currently focused on is the visual discipline?
Yeah, absolutely. Trying to make sure, and we're 2 weeks away from me departing for that trip at this point. As much as I would love to say that I could get my mount a little bit better in 2 weeks, I think at this point in the year, I've got what I got.
Well, I mean,
To
what you got is doing pretty well for you, it seems like it. So,
Well, yeah, and to your point, I feel confident in it. There's a couple of shots that I wish I could get it just a hair more refined on, but it seems like a fool's errand to go and try and reinvent it just for a very small percentage of shots. So, um, I would love to just be able to smooth my mount out just a hair on those longer trap shots, just because it's such a critical shot for your mount to be perfect. But we might see two or three of them the whole week. So I'm gonna basically use my band-aid method for those if I do come across one of them and just try to shoot it as best I can and then rely on the amount that's gotten me this far the rest of the year for the other 197 targets.
what's your philosophy about mounts? For FITASC, I've heard many different things from different coaches about it, and also doing a different mount for different type of presentations. Like you talk about the trap target. One coach I was speaking to, if this is your gun, you're moving everything in sync with each other as you mount, right? But if it was a
Mhm.
trap target, he was actually open to dipping the gun into your back pocket and then lifting it at the end to get that trap like feel as you're mounting it. Do you have philosophies on that or techniques on that that you do for specific targets?
Yeah, very much so. So I think everybody kind of falls into two schools of thought, and I think it's important to learn them both, just like everything else in this game. The one that I certainly rely on the most and that I recommend most people learn doing is keeping the gun basically level and moving both hands the same speed, just because it's a lot easier to do that at the beginning than to try to just kind of fix one hand in a particular spot and then only have one hand working, kind of against the other hand in a sense. So the way that I teach most people and the way that I shoot probably 80%, maybe 90% of the shots that I shoot are with both hands starting relatively low, as if you were to be able to, stick a laser down the gun and have it pointed basically right where the target would be. And then as I raise the gun up in the process of that mount, I'm hopefully level with the bird's line that entire time.
So you're,
Um,
you're using both hands as you bring up to the gun, right? You're
yes.
and are you steering from the back arm or backhand?
Um, so I would say that most of the steering that goes on in the horizontal direction I'm doing with just my body rotation.
Okay.
So I think footwork and feet task is particularly important because we typically shoot much more open spaces just to accommodate all the different targets and shooting from several different positions. So more so than we do in sporting clays, your body rotation becomes very important.
Hmm.
So we basically kind of set your feet up to where you're planning to break a given target, coil yourself up, and then as you call pull, you start to uncoil as you get back to like your neutral position there. That basically accounts for, I would say, 90% of the gun's movement in terms of left and right. And the mount is just, basically raising it from my feet test line to my, you know, actual mounted position.
Right.
So
And you're not
it's,
moving your head much, or are you? Like, are you like? I know everyone's mount's a little bit different, and there's not maybe not a right or wrong, but you tell me. But I feel like for me, as I'm standing a little bit more upright in feet task, and I bring the gun up to my face, my head's not moving at all. I'm just watching the target and moving my body as I mount into the target. But is that kind of how your approach is to this, or how do you do it?
yeah, absolutely. So I want to keep my head basically in the same position throughout the shot as much as I can, if for nothing else, to make that whole process smooth, right? Because the moment that you have to kind of tilt your head or maybe turn it a particular direction to get that gun mounted the way that you would like to, that fluidity that you gain from moving your hands and your body at the same speed of the bird is kind of lost at that point, right? Because we kind of have like a little hitch in the move, so to speak. So there are people that do that very successfully. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that that's like an absolute necessity to be successful in feed test, because frankly, like a guy that I train with frequently, Theo Ribbs, has a move where he kind of turns his head into the gun a little bit as he mounts,
Mhm.
and he shoots trap shots as well as anybody I see. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that it's a necessity by any means. You can have a what I would call, less than perfect mount and really not have that be a detriment to your shooting whatsoever. If you put the time in to really understand all the dynamics of it. So, even though I'm kind of a purist about it and want to make sure that I do everything as if, it was a theoretical setting on a whiteboard and, you could put the shot cam on the gun and it would look real pretty, it's really not, it really doesn't gain you any targets. And frankly, like it's not something that anybody should really concern themselves with that much unless there's something like glaringly wrong.
Hmm.
Because frankly, there's a lot of people that shoot FITASC incredibly well with a mount that, you and I might look at and say, well, that's just kind of ugly looking.
Yeah.
And there's really nothing wrong with that. I mean, if people just looked at my regular sporting clays mount, I mean, I've got 32 degrees of scoliosis. My regular sporting clays mount looks pretty ugly too. So, um, there's a lot of things that you can get away with. And I think for the most part, your eyes do trump everything else, so if you're using your eyes at the level we've described already, then the rest of your form and mechanics can have some flaws and still be very successful.
Right, right. Yeah, I think Anthony demonstrated that between his comparison with George Digweed and him and how they're very different but accomplish the same thing.
Mhm.
You look at like for an example, and this is a very uneducated, but just what I looked at when I watched like Charles Bordeaux shoot FITAS versus like a Richard Fald shooting FITAS, two totally different mounting styles.
Yeah,
The way they hold the gun, even and how they bring it up to their face, is totally different.
right.
So it does it sounds like it just boils down to your computer at the end of the day, right? And what your computer is comfortable with in terms of when you get the gun in your face, how you see everything.
Right. I mean, really all we're trying to do with any of the mechanics in a shotgunning game in general is get your gun speed and your physical motion about as close to the speed of your eyes as possible, right? So the analogy I always kind of utilize when I coach is, well, if you and I are both driving down the highway at 50 miles an hour and I want to throw you an orange, it probably makes the most sense for us to be going the same speed. And frankly, at that point, I can see you as well in your car as if we were both parked, right? The moment that we start going different speeds, the more of a discrepancy we experience, the harder that becomes. So I would say in general, the closer we can get to, matching the speed of all the physical motions that we are making to the speed at which the target is moving, the better you can see.
Yeah.
But there are very different ways to get to that point. There are certain people that are, really gung ho on that speed being consistent the whole shot. That's the kind of the Wendell Cherry school of thought. All of his disciples in some way, shape, or form, the David Raduloviches of the world, like look as though they are perfectly in sync with that bird throughout its entire flight path. And it's honestly super impressive to watch. Most people would describe that school of thought as probably the smoothest method of shooting that there is. Um, but honestly, so long as you get to that point by the end of the shot, it really doesn't quite matter how you get there. It's kind of like watching, Jim Furyk's golf swing. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, but if you're making, good contact at the very bottom when the club hits the ball, none of the rest of it matters.
Right, right. So, has your engineering background helped you analyze or approach targets differently, or how you work in understanding the game?
Uh, yeah, I would say it definitely has played a role. I'm a big math guy, so the geometry has always interested me, the physics and the kinematics of, how a target rises and falls very much play into the things that I like to do, or like to do in school. So yeah, I would say I'm a super nerdy dude when it comes to the math behind it. And it's I don't know if it's a blessing or a curse. It's probably a little bit of both because, you don't really want to be sitting there doing mental math in the middle of a shot being in the air. But that level of understanding can be beneficial sometimes as well, especially in a coaching perspective more than anything else too, because I think it helps articulate to some of the more analytical brains out there. I work a lot with people in the oil field, just being that I'm from Houston. So they understand and resonate very well when I say something along the lines of like, oh, well, that target's arcing and your gun's making a tangent line to that. And, that's not something that I would ever think about actively in my own shooting, but that ability to communicate can be helpful sometimes to similar minded people. Yeah, it's a weird dynamic for sure because I try to simplify the game as much as I can to actually execute at a high level, but that deeper understanding I think is helpful at times.
What engineering aspects have been helpful for you, and other than description, but like in analyzing the target path or the plan that you're going to use?
So something as simple as like kind of understanding like a target's concavity and what it's going to do in terms of air resistance. So like when you're looking at a target that's showing you belly, being the bottom side of the target, you can almost assume more often than not that that bird's going to slow down at a quicker rate of pace, meaning that's going to decelerate faster than the same exact target thrown with edge or with dome. Simply because that bottom side of the target kind of creates this like cupping effect with the wind, and the wind's pushing on it a little bit harder, so it stalls more so than a edgier version of that same target might. Um, so there's some things like that, and again, if you don't really need any of that knowledge to understand how to kill a target like that. You just kind of it helps maybe differentiate between one or the other in figuring out, a particular presentation. So again, like we talked about a couple of times already, if you're using your eyes really well and perceiving the speed for what it is at its break point, then really none of that stuff matters.
Mhm.
But kind of understanding the general trend or pattern of what a particular target might be doing might make up for a lapse in good vision if, like I might gain an extra bird just really understanding what the target's flight path is doing if I don't execute perfectly visually that I may not have if I didn't have that knowledge.
Right, because you're giving yourself more of the input information that you need so that your output can do what it needs to do.
Right.
Right.
Yep, exactly.
No, interesting. What are the most overlooked parts of preparation that you think separate elite shooters from everyone else? I'll tell you, like the one time I shot with Anthony in FITASC at a Western Regional, I just realized I don't work at all compared to what Anthony does. I mean, he is
Sure.
working the whole time he's there, even when he's not in the ring shooting, he's analyzing, thinking, looking at angles. Like, is that what you think separates elite shooters from the average person, or what do you think it is?
Yeah, so I think it'd be really easy to look at, a pro shooter. Again, we've used Zach a lot as an example, so we'll just use him. It might look as though all of this stuff is happening very effortlessly when he goes up and shoots, just because he doesn't take a whole lot of time. It doesn't look like he's studying the bird with a particular intensity or anything, but I promise you there's a lot going on in his head that we don't see.
Mhm.
Um, I think the biggest thing that is misunderstood is how well the pros are visualizing what's happening. And what I mean by that is almost like rehearsing when and where their vision is going to work on the targets. So, when you see a shooter up there in the box and he's in between pairs, for example, everybody's got their own pre-shot routine or like things that they're actively, kind of talking to themselves about. The pros that are really executing at the best level, I think, are doing a very good job of keeping their thoughts about as visual as possible and as, well, I mean, almost like meticulously rehearsed to the extent that like they kind of drone the vision into a sense of monotony that takes their mind from very conscious activity to subconscious activity. And we could get into this whole topic about pre-shot routine, but to me, the basic purpose that that serves is as a trigger or a cue to get your conscious mind to kind of deactivate and activate your subconscious muscle memory that exists. So for me, how I try to achieve that is by visualizing what I'm seeing enough times over and over and over again until I've kind of beat it into my brain and it feels kind of dull and senseless. But at that point, I realize that my brain is not really, thinking consciously at that point. So that kind of is the transition between the very conscious planning phase where I'm just actively thinking about a lot of different things related to my gun and the target and how they interact, and just executing the shot based on the vision itself.
So if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, because I think this is super important, but I think, I've touched on this with other pros. it's moving from that conscious thinking to subconscious thinking, but you do it by focusing on the process and you kind of getting your brain into kind of like a meditative mode. Does that sound right?
Yeah. So, one of the things that I've kind of taken from another person's game, and I hope he doesn't mind me divulging this information. I don't think he would, but I talked to Corey Cruz a while ago about the mental game and how he approached it, and this was after a shoot that I had a very good chance of winning and very much kind of gave it away in the last couple of stations on targets that you would think I shouldn't have. Um, and for those of the people out there that haven't seen Corey shoot, like Corey very much goes out there and like traces targets with his gun. It basically looks like he's kind of just rehearsing the shot physically. Um, but he's very much doing the same thing I'm doing, just with the gun also involved in that process. So even though I'm doing it without the gun up, I'm very much going through the motions of this is where I'm going to have my eyes set. This is what the bird's going to look like at the very end of that shot. This is what the transition to the second bird feels like, and then go through that same process again. And the more times that you do that, you're kind of like blocking out all the conscious distractions that may come up, whether that's performance anxiety or that extra rush of adrenaline or whatever that, distraction is or that obstacle is. We try to block that out by just kind of flooding your brain with visual thoughts.
Hmm.
And that to me kind of solves this whole mental game conversation in a sense, because it's very easy to sit there and try to say, okay, well, if my brain is a pie chart, maybe I've got a pie slicer that's just nervousness that's trying to take away from my conscious activity. Maybe I have a pie slicer that's the dog barking in the background or the trapper slow pulled the last guy. Maybe he's going to slow pull me too. All those different thoughts that may come into your head, are very much taking away from your ability to execute the shot by looking at it well. All of that stuff is just, taking away from your finite brain's, focus on a particular subject matter. So rather than try to, dissect and figure out what pie slicer's taking chunks out of my pie, I just try to fill it back up. So if I can just flood my brain with all those visual thoughts to the extent that all of my brain is focused on that, then it really doesn't leave any room for the rest of the stuff to creep back in.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, are you rehearsing? You say you don't do it physically. You're doing it more, you're just visualizing and maybe using your body a little bit, or
Yeah, really, and honestly, really, you don't even have to be looking at the field of the target itself. I mean, if you kind of have memorized that in your brain, like you can almost just do it internally.
Mhm.
Um, but it's so like when you see somebody like Zach shoots, it doesn't look like he's like, working as hard as Anthony might be working in terms of like what you actually physically see him do. But I promise you, he's thinking about it and visualizing it as often as Anthony is.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, everybody has it a different way, right? Like Corey physically does it. Anthony, you see him doing it, but he's not physically doing it. Like he may just be looking and paying really close attention, where Zach looks like he just steps up, but he's been visualizing it the whole time he's been watching it, right?
correct. Yes. Yeah, very different schools of thought there. I mean, like somebody like Joe Finizzi looks like I don't want to say that he makes it look harder because I don't think that's remotely accurate, but it looks like he's grinding the entire time that he's out there because he's in the box a decent amount of time. He's very, very meticulous with his planning. And you see it all kind of manifest itself physically, but I promise at the end of the day, that process is in reality very similar to what everybody else is doing as well. That's only taking maybe 2 or 3 seconds in the box between pairs.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, he has a very unique, at least from what I've seen, and I don't know him at all or anything, but he tends to trace, instead of doing the physical part, he tends to trace it with his finger. Has he ever explained that to you as far as his process or?
Um, I probably wouldn't do it any justice to describe it. But again, like I think the entire process is just the getting the visual timing correct.
Right.
Um, he's mapping it out with his finger the same exact way Corey would with his gun in his face, and the same way I would honestly just sitting in the cart thinking about it. Because like when I'm in that cart and have seen that pair a couple of times, like I'm not going really back to the cart and looking at the cup holder. Like I'm staring a hole in the ground, but my eyes think that I'm seeing that target.
Right, right. I think I'm a little bit similar to you too. As long as I've seen it and I know what it's doing, I'll like kind of go through a little mental checklist of, okay, it's far. This is the speed. This is the angle. I'm gonna probably break it here because I can see it better against the sky versus the bushes over here. So I start telling myself all the input stuff, if you will. It sounds like you do the same, just to a much better
Yeah.
better outcome than me.
Sometimes, I mean, I'll tell you as much. I mean, I screw it up as much as anybody. But yeah, my goal when I go to any particular station is to get two or three good show pairs in where I'm just gonna identify. I'm probably gonna use the first pair to just basically map out the shot, figure out what the angle is. The second shot, I'm kind of trying to pick out those couple of visual points that I have, and you can keep it as simple as what the bird looks like at the break point and where you're going to set your eyes in order to achieve good vision at that spot.
Mhm.
And then the last one is kind of just testing it, right? Just making sure that that place that I picked does allow me to see that bird really well at the break point. And the moment that I feel confident that that is a viable option, I'm really not going to look at a whole lot more.
You're one of the best shooters in the world at the moment. What have you picked up from shooting with other, world-class shooters? Like, is there anything in particular that you're like, I need to incorporate that into my repertoire, if you will?
I mean, you try to pick up something everywhere you go. I mean, I'm fortunate that I have grown up around a lot of other good shooters and have always had good input. Because the only formal lesson I've ever really had is Zach Kanebaum, but I've picked up a lot of stuff from Anthony, just sitting under the Beretta tent, listening to him talk. Every time that I've gone out and practiced with my buddy Theo Ribbs, him and I are kind of training partners at this point because he moved to Houston uh, right at the beginning of the year.
Oh, right
Um,
on.
so him and I shoot a lot
No longer in
together, and
Austin.
yes, correct.
He's
So
in.
he's in Houston full time now. So he's kind of my new shooting buddy, and we bounce ideas off of each other. And um, you
Is
know,
there
I
anything specific you could share? Like when you heard Anthony talking in the tent, what piqued like your interest, or what did you pick up, if you can remember?
um, so like something of note that I thought about the last time that I went through Anthony's book was he has this whole concept behind no feel targets, which is basically very low speed at distance where you just don't really have a whole lot of feeling of connection that we normally get. Um, And he says at that particular point that he feels like he sees less clarity on the target than he would any other example, and a little bit more aware of like the space between his gun and the bird. Um, for the rest of that, you're gonna have to go by the book. But long story short, what I came to incorporate into my own game was this understanding that, well, at even at distance, if a bird doesn't take a whole lot of lead, it's very, very difficult to get the gun out of the way to be able to see the bird any better than you would if you were pointed right at it. Because frankly, the moment you move the gun out of the way, you're missing somewhere where the bird's not going to be.
Mhm.
So I would say as a general rule of thumb, targets that take less than a foot of lead, you can assume you're going to be more aware of where the gun is because it's just in the way of what you're trying to focus on. Obviously, the more lead that something takes, the further removed your gun becomes from that equation, and frankly, the better vision of bird we probably get.
You've been competing since you were young. Like, how has your relationship with the sport evolved over that time?
Um, I've always been very thankful to have been in this community just because I think it shaped me into the person I am today. The community is very much a nurturing one for a young adult. I think I learned a lot of good lessons at a young age and a lot of good values, and I'm at the stage now where I would say that by no means I have it all figured out, but I've learned enough to where I can start to impart some of the wisdom I've picked up back to the younger generations and even older generations too. Um, but I would say as a whole, I have a lot more respect and appreciation and reverence for the people that did it before and figured it all out the hard way. Because, I mean, again, the information we have at our disposal now is just so much bigger and grander than it ever was even 10 years ago. I think the sport's evolved a lot in that period of time,
Right.
but there's
More
also
accessible.
probably more good shooters than ever. And I
Hmm.
think that's largely because of how readily accessible all this information is. So I think that's also why in the last 10 years, you've seen Americans start to win at a world stage because the previous 30 we hadn't. So I think that speaks volumes to the guys that put in the work to figure all this stuff out. And, I, as a shooter, very much am trying to achieve the same level of that work that they put into that because you can see how well it manifests itself in the results that they've achieved. And then as an instructor, trying to make sure that that information just continues to both evolve with the game and then get disseminated down to the next generation.
Yeah, and speaking of instructor, you've been coaching now, and so you're at the Greater Houston Gun Club. That's where you're coaching.
Yes.
Okay. How long have you been doing that?
So I started doing this full time in August of 2023. I worked for a couple of years right out of school, actually using my degree, and was a project manager at a little civil construction company. And then shot as much as I could during that period of time and was giving lessons on the side just to kids that I had already kind of developed a relationship with. Um, and then that slowly grew into like, I would say that summer of 2023, like this level of uh, lesson interest that I just was never anticipating. It was never really a goal of mine to do this full time. Um, but at that point, it was kind of just the right thing at the right time. And my wife and I had talked about it, and we were like, well, if there was ever a time to do something like this and make this crazy change to go self-employed, like now's the time. We didn't have kids yet. Even though we're expecting one soon, I mean, I've been blessed enough to kind of develop a clientele base that should be able to support me for a long time. And Houston's a great area for that too. I don't know that it would be possible for me to have done that if I weren't geographically set up where I am, just because there's so many people that shoot. Greater Houston's probably the most heavily trafficked, gun club in the United States, just in terms of how many people show up on a daily basis. So I've got a lot of opportunities for instruction, whether that be at a corporate entertainment level where it's all very just fun and lighthearted and just trying to get people to hit targets and have a good time. And then there's also some of the very best shooters in the country here as well.
No, that's awesome. I need to get down there. I've never been. I've been to Houston, but I've never been to the gun club there, and would love to shoot. So, can you tell us a little bit about the gun club?
Yeah, it's been around since I want to say the year was 1959, but grew up as a skeet club primarily, and a lot of like the legends of the sport from back in the 50s, 60s, 70s shot in the Houston area. So um, there's a guy named Bob Brister who's responsible for a lot of the stuff we know about like chokes and shot patterns and things of that nature.
Yeah, I think it was
That
one of
was
his books.
Yeah, I've actually got one right here.
Yeah.
But he's a guy that, did a lot of the hardcore learning that we're talking about, like just figuring out the hard way, and put in a lot of that work at Greater Houston. So it's got a lot of history to it. Now they have done a really good job of trying to make that club into one of the premier clubs in the entire United States. And it's very well rounded. I mean, we've got a pretty strong skeet following still, even though skeet in Texas is generally kind of declining at this point. They've got 4 courses with, several that are set up to cater to corporate events and people shooting at a relatively novice or intermediate level. And then some of the toughest targets you'll ever see. So on the other side of the property. So they incorporate just about every different level of shooter that they possibly can and make them all feel included. And I think they've done a super good job of that here recently.
Are you target setting out there as well, or?
No, not really. So, I mean, I'm entirely like I'm not employed by the club or anything. They let me coach out of out of the kindness of their hearts and the fact that I probably bring them a couple members a year. But um, the targets that are out there since I want to say about October of last year is a guy named Trevor Shanahan. He's a shooter himself and a good one. And he brought us a lot of cool experience because Texas can kind of be its own little bubble in a lot of ways. And because he has been involved at other gun clubs and shot at a lot of other places, he brought us a new target setting perspective that I think is super cool and useful to us as a competitive community. But yeah, he's done a fantastic job since he's been here.
Right on, right on. Yeah, I've heard of his name, and I've seen some of his posts on Facebook. So no, that's right on. That's awesome.
Yeah, he's also one of the best duck callers you'll ever see.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, I think he's like a 2 or 3 time like duck calling world champion.
World champion. Okay, nice.
Yeah.
Is there anything about the shooting world you wish more people understood?
As a whole, I would say the people in the shooting community pretty much know what they need to know. I would say, you know, don't undervalue your instructors because again, shortening that learning curve is such a huge advantage if your goal is to become very competitive and everybody's got different goals. Um, but seek out an instructor that's knows what they're doing. Sometimes that's easier said than done. There's a lot of guys out there that, advertise the world and may not be the best instructor, but go to someone that you've seen vouched for before and, kind of just put your game in their hands for a little bit and see where it takes you because that's how I got to this spot and I wouldn't change it for any other development in my childhood for sure.
Right on. You've got a couple of interesting things coming up. One, you've got FITASC, but more
Mhm.
importantly, you've got a baby on the way.
Yeah.
What are you like the things coming up for you now? Like you're gonna focus on obviously World FITASC and winning that. Uh,
Yeah.
so how are you, I know we talked a little bit about how you're preparing for it, but like how are you going into it mentally right now to prepare?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've had people ask me all year, like, well, is the news of the baby like driving you to have had a pretty successful year thus far? And I don't know what the answer to that question is, frankly.
Meaning like
I,
you're trying to cram it all in right now, or because you don't feel like you'll be able to, or what?
I do feel like there's a little bit of urgency that kicked in, and I started to work a little bit harder in the off season. But to be fair, I was already not happy with my performance last season, so I was already putting in a good amount of work at that point. Just with I mean, a lot of other stuff going on last year, just didn't wind up being that good of a year for me, which, is totally okay. That happens. But I was definitely hungry to get after it this year and implement some new things into my shooting that I felt like I had been not so good at in 2024. So, um, yeah, I mean, there is a little bit of a sense of like, well, yeah, if we can check a couple items off the bucket list of events that I'd like to win, like, let's do it. But by the same token, I am also very aware of the fact that, even as well as I feel I'm shooting at this moment, anybody can shoot well for any given stretch of 200 birds. So my goal is to kind of just forget that the rest of that happened. And even though I still want to carry over that confidence, I want to take the approach of like, well, I still got a lot of work left to do. So up until World FITASC, I'll be working at it pretty hard after that. Just because FITASC was my focus this year, that's kind of a part of the season where I'll take a little bit of a break through most of August and probably part of September. And I'll probably miss a handful of regionals that I would have liked to have made just because of all the family stuff we got going on. But um, sometimes there's just more important things. So I'll take a couple months
Xfinity will
off.
always be here for you, you know?
Yeah, it's always going to be. The other great thing about the situation I'm in is my wife loves to shoot too. So
Well, that's the biggest understatement I'd say. I mean, she's also Lady World FITASC champion herself. So I was
exactly.
actually surprised. Does she shoot with you? Do you guys train together, or do you guys talk about this together as a couple? That was actually going to be my next question about it.
There was a point in time where we kind of first met where we were shooting together a good bit and, bouncing ideas off of each other because she grew up with a very different background than I did in shooting because she grew up through kind of the 4-H program in Texas. Um, so I kind of got her a little bit more exposure to sporting clays as a community and some of the different, more complex techniques. But she's always had this ability to just get the job done mentally that I've admired for a very long time. I really don't know how to explain it exactly, but I've tried my best to copy it. Um, Sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But she's just the type of person that the more pressure you give her, she tends to just thrive in that environment. And I'm
She's
very
a
much not
nurse,
that
right?
way. Yeah, it's weird.
It's the nursing. My mom's a nurse. I've been around a lot of nurses growing up. A lot of the South Indian moms that came over from India or wherever they were from to the U.S. are nurses. So I've been around a lot of nurses. They can handle a lot. They're
Yeah.
dealing with stress every day in their job. Like they do not have they have one of the hardest jobs out there, right? And they're constantly dealing with the stress of what am I going to have to deal with next? And it just becomes this thing where they can just handle a lot of stress. I feel like it. That's my theory at least, but I'd be curious to know what Megan says about that.
Yeah, I mean, it lends a lot of perspective. And, I think that's probably been the biggest thing that I've been trying to focus on this year is, to answer your original question, my goal for this year is really to just proceed in life in general with the perspective that, you know, my individual identity and the identity of our little family is greater than that of just shooting, right? And that takes some of the pressure off of it in and of itself. Just trying to compete and break clay targets in the sky because there are greater things at play in the world than that right now. As much as I, have made it my life's, you know, my life's work to some extent, there are definitely far more important things. So, um, that striking that balance, I think, has honestly made me a better shooter. And I'm still, very much not perfect at it, but trying to figure it out as I go.
Well, speaking of that, outside of shooting, what's your one personal and professional goal that you'd like to focus on or that you're excited about?
Um, as a personal goal, I mean, obviously professionally, like I want to see all the people that I coach succeed as much as possible outside of my own shooting because I derive a lot of joy from that as well. I mean, that means I'm hopefully articulating things well and trying to communicate as well as I possibly can. Um, I think my end goal would be to try to give something back to the community greater than just my knowledge of shooting, but something that would be able to allow more kids to experience what I did growing up. I mean, I was very fortunate that my family was well off financially, to where I could make it to all these shoots. And it's a very expensive game at the end of the day. So whatever we could do to help subsidize that, I'm fully on board with trying to be a implement of that.
Okay. Like, are you thinking about starting a foundation or something that helps more kids get into it and get financial support, or that's
Yeah, I mean,
probably
I think the first step is just trying to resolve as much internally as we can. I mean, I serve on the Texas State Sporting Clays board right now as the VP. I've been on it for I think 6 years total now, somewhere in there. And definitely would like to get involved on the national level as well at some point. But yeah, just trying to advocate for the young shooters, but all of the shooters, right? I mean, try to make sure that this sport thrives and stays alive, not because of my love of the game itself, but just because I think it's such a good humanitarian tool for community and, people learning valuable lessons about themselves. I mean, I think this is a very all-encompassing, well-rounded sport for building young people's personalities. And even me as a 26-year-old, I feel like it teaches me something every day.
yeah, absolutely, man. I can't agree with you more on that. I've met some of the best people, met some of the best juniors, kids, whatever you call it, right? In terms of manners, in terms of respect, in terms of kind of how they go about the world, how they carry themselves in the world. You're an example of that. I mean, you're a great communicator, great ambassador for the sport. It's another reason why I wanted to interview you, because you're very articulate. You think about the game in a deep way, and you also see the broader context of the game as well, not just as a competitor. So, I sincerely appreciate your time, Dominic. This has been a fun interview to do. So I'm excited for you for World FITASC too. I'm going to be watching very carefully and closely and seeing you succeed. So
Thanks, Henning. I appreciate it, man. It was a pleasure.
yeah, well, thank you, Dominic. We'll chat soon, and please send my regard to Megan as well.
All righty, will do. Good to catch up with you, man.
Take care.